Well, old Michael Baden is blowing the whistle on the Epstein so-called autopsy, the one that resulted in Epstein's death being ruled a suicide by hanging, of all things. Michael Baden, I believe people like to call him a celebrity coroner, which is a little bit of a funny title, but basically he's a guy who's looked at a lot of important dead bodies in his life, and he's often brought in as a star witness on in high-profile murder cases and things like that. And he's, just sort of a third-party guy who will go in and observe dead bodies and get a second opinion that isn't, from the government coroner. And his opinion from the beginning, after looking at Epstein's body, was that he was probably murdered. And the reason for that is that, as I've discussed in the past, it's been a while, but that the hyoid bone in the neck apparently is something that normally wouldn't break if you're trying to choke yourself to death, or like Epstein did, and that normally that's something that happens when someone is being forcefully choked. This is kind of a sign of a struggle, I guess you could say. But the government coroner, wasn't quite as certain in her determination. I believe the doctor was a woman, and it wasn't exactly the coroner that was examining the body. It was just, some person who works for the coroner's office. That woman wrote that essentially that the cause was still pending further review. So meaning they would have to go over more evidence. And what kind of evidence would that be to determine whether this was a homicide or not? Well, they'd have to do things like check for DNA under Epstein's fingernails, which Dr. Baden says that he observed and saw them do during the autopsy. So that should have been sent off and had the DNA examined to see if there was any DNA on there that wasn't Epstein's. And likewise, you would have wanted to examine, what is referred to as the ligature, which is, the device used to strangle Epstein or for him to hang himself, which they had. It was, it was made from, the bed sheets that are used in that part of the prison. So therefore, if that was made by someone else and then used to strangle Epstein, there should be DNA on there, assuming that the person didn't use gloves, which I'm sure they would. But, and Baden doesn't mention that, which I found kind of strange, because I don't know why he was harping so much on trying to get DNA off the ligature, because if anything, that would, I would think that if the person was wearing, proper thick gloves, like any, good professional murderer would, I wouldn't expect there to be any DNA left on that that wasn't Epstein's. You would think it would all just be, skin cells from rubbing on Epstein's neck. And so, if anything, I would think that, say, releasing the results of the DNA analysis of the ligature may, discredit the idea that Epstein was murdered, because they would say, see, we didn't find anyone else's DNA on the ligature, so obviously Epstein wasn't murdered. Well, what you really want to focus on, the only thing that I think that would produce any fruit, and again, I'm not a professional, so maybe Michael Baden has his reasons for thinking that the ligature should have, DNA evidence. And that is, of course, Epstein's fingernails, which, if someone's being attacked, normally they'll try and swipe at a person and they might scratch them a little bit, and they'll get a little bit of their skin, dead skin cells under their fingernails, and, that's how often they identify attackers in a lot of murders. And, of course, the FBI has not released the results of the DNA analysis of that either. All we know is that William Barr says he looked at the evidence and he said, yep, there's nothing here that seems to suggest anything other than suicide to me. And then he stamped suicide on Epstein's death certificate, and that's all that we're supposed to think about it. Because William Barr says we're not supposed to worry about it, even though William Barr's father was the one who hired Epstein at a prestigious private school in New York City. William Barr and the Department of Justice are just supposed to be considered, impartial third parties in all of this. Not to mention the fact that the Department of Justice may have been influenced by one of the many, many people, many powerful people who Epstein had dirt on. So it's very important that old Michael Baden is out blowing the whistle on this, because somebody has to, and he, I think, is in a better position than anybody really to do that, because he was there, present for the autopsy. He saw what he says is evidence of homicide, because he said there was an interview on Fox and Friends that in his whole career he had never seen a case where you had these kinds of fractures that Epstein had, where the cause of death was actually suicide. Every time that you saw these kinds of injuries, that was a case in which someone was murdered by strangulation, not dead by hanging themselves. And so really, we really need to know what happened in the interim between the autopsy, in which the examiner, who Michael Baden was observing, they could not make a determination on Epstein's cause of death, whether it was suicide or homicide. So what happened after that that led the DOJ to determining that, in fact, Epstein had killed himself and that he had not been murdered? What evidence did they see that allowed them to clear that up? Because it's not just like, oh, well, we can't figure it out, so we're just going to say it's suicide. That's not how it's supposed to work. If you don't have enough evidence to determine whether something is suicide or homicide, you leave it as undetermined. So there has to be something that the FBI used as evidence to suggest that that suggested to them that this was in fact a suicide. And of course, they may not be willing to share that information, what exactly their rationale is, because in all likelihood it's probably BS. It's probably the case that, because I don't think there are too many people out there, except for wild, crazy conspiracy theorists, that actually think Epstein killed himself. I mean, this happened in a New York City jail, so, not exactly the kind of place that's free of corruption. And so, if you're still uncomfortable with the idea that this was a murder that was covered up, I don't know what to tell you at this point. I think that, the train's left the station, and so if you're still sitting back there, I'm just going to leave you behind. So to me, what really matters at this point is not determining whether this was a murder or not. It's determining, how exactly the DOJ decided to cover this up. And it's about trying to bring this story back into the public consciousness, because it is, or at least it should be, the biggest story of my lifetime, certainly. A story of how a supposed billionaire, abused young children, and then blackmailed powerful people by letting them sleep with young children and recording them, and then how he ultimately was murdered by probably, one of the people who he blackmailed for so long. Or maybe he was killed by his former employers, CIA or the Mossad. We don't know at this point. There's so much that has been left unsaid in this case. And so I hope that, old Dr. Michael Baden doesn't end up, killing himself, soon after he comes out and starts advocating on behalf of the truth here. I hope that he's able to survive long enough and really make a stink about this, so that, maybe the government will eventually be forced to tell the truth. And if not, at least he will stir up enough doubt to where no one in America will buy into the official narrative. That almost is a better outcome, because you want people to be skeptical of the government in general, because it comes out in a case like this, it's especially obvious that the government's lying. But generally speaking, the official narrative is crafted not based around the truth, but based around what the government wants you to think, based on what is most convenient for people in power. That's why certain cases are just buried, and then others are accentuated in the media. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.